Alright, so I've got a system. My problem is, we want to control the disc when we move the vertebra. Oops, sorry, I got the vertebra selected, not the joint. So right now, when I move the vertebra, the discs just stay there. Okay? So I'm going to hide the joints for a second. And I'm going to come down, let's say here, and I'm going to actually hide my my vertebra, just to make it a little easier to see. Okay, and let's pick this disc. Now, one thing I've done is I've made sure that I've selected all the discs. Let's get rid of the other two vertebrae, at least hide them for a second. So I selected all the discs, and I said edit, delete by type history, and I also said modify, freeze transformations. Now they're all set over here to 000, but before, each one of these discs had a unique set of translation and rotation and scale values. Those values, when animated, will sometimes add a second set of instructions, so your animation won't work or won't follow the path or the what you anticipate. Instead, you'll get this double set of instructions, so it might move twice as far, or it might scale while it was moving. So the best way to protect against that is before you animate anything, or before you rig it, before you add other elements like deformers, this is what we're doing here, your best bet is to say freeze transformations, so that this then says all 0 and 1 for the scale. And then the last thing I do is also say center pivot. So just real quick, delete by type history, modify, freeze transformations, modify, center pivot. Okay, so I've done that for all the discs. Now I've got this disc selected. I'm going to go and say deform and create a lattice. Now the lattice has a set of values here, x, y, and z, for the number of divisions. I'm going to leave that at 2, and what you'll see is it will create a box. You can see there's one above it for the other disk. So this box now, if I right mouse and say lattice points, when I move one of those points, I'm now moving a collection of CVs on the polygon. The closer the CVs are to that lattice point, the more influence the lattice point has on those CVs. So if we went to the perspective window for a second, you could see a little easier how I'm only really altering CVs over here. So what we want to do is go back to the side view, and I want to take all 4 of those top lattice points. Okay. Matter of fact, let's do this. Let's open up so that you can see in the perspective window what I'm doing. So I've dragged a box. I said right mouse on the lattice and said lattice point. I dragged a box. Now I have all 4. And then I'm going to add another deformer. This is called the cluster. So that cluster now, if I move it, it will control all 4 of those. So you see now I've got the top half of the disk under control of that cluster. If I get these bottom 4 points, again add a cluster, and move it, now I can control the bottom. Okay. So now what value is that, or how does that help us? So let's go back and show our vertebra again. Let's see, I think I have to say show all because I did that 2 steps. There we go. Okay, so we know that the rig will control the vertebra. So what we really want to do is get the vertebra to control these clusters. So this cluster, okay, this is L1. So I'm going to put L1 inferior, INF, and this cluster is L2 superior, okay? So L1 inferior, I want to parent that to L1, to not to the disk, but actually to the surface right there. So I'm going to middle mouse drag it onto the surface. Okay. So now there's my L1 has got the cluster we just did, and I had done one just previously above. Okay. Now this other L2, that needs to go to the surface for lumbar 2. So lumbar 2 vertebra is down here. So I can add that there. Okay. So what does that do? All right. So if I take the joint L1 that's controlling the vertebra and all the joints below it in the hierarchy. See, now I'm distorting. Okay. Now if I take the joint above it at T12, see, it's controlling that. So when the vertebra moves, or let's put it in correct perspective, when the joint moves, it controls the vertebra. When the vertebra moves, it controls a cluster. When the cluster moves, it controls 4 lattice points. The lattice points are on a lattice, which controls the disk. So the joint is in control top of the system, and everything else falls in line. Okay. Now, if I rotate that joint and I put it back to 0, now I'm back where I want to be. All right. So that's how we get a rig and control the disks.